Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us again for another episode of MidWeek Worship. I'm Jeff, and we're Two Cities Church. If you're connecting with us for the first time, if you'll look below me, you see some information about this episode, but you'll also see a link to a YouTube video. If you will go ahead and check out that video after this broadcast is over with, it'll tell you more about our church. It'll tell you more about me and about why we're doing this broadcast. As we start to study about who Jesus is, the theological topic we're calling Christology, the study of Jesus Christ. We've talked about his names, and we've talked about his titles, and we've talked about the way the Bible refers to him, even Jesus' favorite title for himself. Last week, we said Jesus was 100% God, and there are some false religions out there that say, hey, he was a pretty good man, but he wasn't really God. Now, last week, we nailed it down. He was 100% God. Well, this week, we're going to look at Jesus' nature, how Jesus is human, and how Jesus is God. We're tying this week into last week and showing you this is the complete picture of Jesus. And in order to prepare you for what we're going to hear from the Bible, in order to prepare you for a couple of theology terms that you might not have heard before, I want us to get our heart prepared for this. So I want us to sing one song. I've asked our friends from South Africa, Pete and Alish, to prepare a song that we're going to sing together, and it is going to be our way of worshiping King Jesus. So why don't you go ahead and turn the volume up? The words will be right there at the bottom of the screen. Why don't you sing along with Pete and Alish as they lead us in a praise song for King Jesus.
And as the deep panteth for the waters, so my soul longeth after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. And as the deer panteth for the waters, so my soul longeth after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. Tell him it's him and him alone, you alone. Oh, you alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. As the deer panteth for the waters, so my soul longeth after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. Nothing else satisfies but you. I long to worship you.
All right, now that we've been singing that song, it's time for us to dig into the Bible a little bit. And what I ask you to do each week as a church, and if you're connecting with our church, would you commit a Bible verse to memory? Most of these verses are really small and they're easy to commit to memory. You can do it in 15 minutes. Well, tonight's a little bit bigger, but it's actually really, really important that you hear from John chapter 1. Because this is the way the New Testament refers to Jesus. And by the way, if you're familiar with the Bible, the language in John chapter 1, verse 1 is going to sound a lot like the beginning of the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. I'm going to put the Bible verse on the screens. If you've got a family gathered around the TV right now, I want you to read this verse out loud with me. I want you to read where it's found in the Bible, but I want you to practice memorizing it. And you may have to break it in sections this week, but put a little bit of energy into it and memorize John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word, that is a reference. Notice the capital W. It's a reference to Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We observed His glory. The glory as the one and the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1, verse 14. Now, as I said, that verse is a reference to Jesus. The word in there is capitalized, and it's capitalized because it is a proper name. It is a reference to Jesus. It's a title for Jesus. And what the Bible is saying at the beginning of John chapter 1, verse 14 is Jesus became flesh, and John, who walked with Jesus on those dusty streets of Jerusalem, said, "We beheld him. I could touch him and see him and hear him with my own ears." That verse is really, really important because over the years, people have really, really been confused, and frankly, they have taught heresy about how Jesus can be all the way God, what we learned last week, and be all the way man, like we're looking at this week. And some of those heresies were not intended to deliberately disrupt people's faith. It was just brilliant minds struggling to figure out how is it possible that he could be all the way God and all the way man in the same person at the same time. So I'm going to put 3 names on the screens for you, and I'm going to try to describe how these 3 ideas have distorted the humanity and the physical nature of Jesus. The first is a word called docetism. Now, the beginning of that word means, the language here, the Greek language, the beginning of that word means seems like or appears like. And what this heresy says is, no, Jesus really was God, and we want to just slap high fives. You got that part right. But then they say, but he really, really wasn't man. Actually, he kind of looked like a man, and he seemed like a man, but he really wasn't a man. He appeared, dosa, or the Greek preface to this word. He appeared like a man, but he really wasn't a man. And the guy who wrote John chapter 1, verse 14, John, the follower of Jesus, said, oh no, I watched that man eat food. I saw that man sweat. That man got tired, and I could touch him and hear him, and I was in his presence. So docetism says, John, you just think that he was a man. He just appeared to be a man, but he really wasn't a man. He was actually God who was in a hologram form. Next word on the screen. It's a word called Apollinarianism. Now, if you can't figure it out, some of these heresies are named after the guy who came up with this idea. Want to take a guess what the name of the guy was that came up with this idea? You got it. His name was Apollos. Not the same Apollo that you read about in the New Testament from 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that guy was a real Christian going around telling people who Jesus was. There was a teacher in the church by the name of Apollo. He had some followers. And what Apollo taught is that Jesus didn't really have the soul of a man. He was physical, but he didn't have a man's soul. And again, it was because Apollo was struggling with this whole idea. Now, those first two on the screen have been around for many, many centuries, with people struggling to figure out, how can he really be man and really be God at the same time? There's a third one on the screen. This one came around later. It actually came around about 75 years ago. And the last idea on the screen, this kenotic theory, there were people who thought, well, Jesus actually seemed like a man, and he actually didn't really have the soul of a man. Really, what we have with Jesus is that he gave the impression of a man, that he was less than man. He was all the way God, but he wasn't all the way man. And the whole kenotic theory is God can't totally dwell inside a human being. So if Jesus is going to be all the way God, and we want to compliment them on that point, then he really can't be all the way man. And this is where even some modern scholars got it wrong with the kenotic theory of Jesus's humanity. Look, I'm giving you some of these other names because I want you to be on your guard. If somebody tries to explain, well, Jesus really wasn't a man, you have some arguments now on why he was. Or from last week, yeah, he was a man, but he really wasn't God. He was just a good man, but he wasn't the God man. You have some arguments from last week on how to answer that question. But now it's time for me to ask you a question. And it's a question I want you to spend some time thinking about before you answer it. In fact, I'm going to put the question on the screen in just a second. But before I do this, I'm just going to tell you, this question may be a little bit shocking to you. And it may cause you to have a gut reaction answer to it. I need you to pause, and I need you to think carefully before you answer this question. This question is going to end the broadcast. I'm not going to answer it for you. But if you have a family, I want you to talk about this as a family. If you've never thought about this before, I want you to think about it, because here's the question. Does God approve of human sacrifice? You see, if Jesus was a man and Jesus' death on a cross was a sacrifice made to God on your behalf so that your sins could be forgiven, now you and I have to answer the question, does God really approve of human sacrifice? And I want you to think before you answer this question as we end this broadcast this week. I'll see you next week.